All right, and so I want to welcome you all to the Enterprise Agile Global Community. This group, this is actually our first presentation without our founder. I think our founder is now in Indiana. This meetup started as a local meetup in San Francisco. But it was mostly enterprise agile people, and it started as sort of an intro to agile meetup, and we pivoted after 2 or 3 years to say, almost everybody here is about enterprise, and there's just not enough enterprise conversation going on in the agile community. We should focus on that. And so we shifted to that. And then when the pandemic came along and we found ourselves entirely online, we became global, and then our founder moved to Indiana, and Mary came in and joined us from San Diego, and we haven't had another Indiana, sorry, another Indiana-based co-chair, and so we became fairly global across the United States anyway. This is not a terribly good time for Europe, so but not too bad maybe for Asia. So we've been around for 7 or 8 or 9 years, I think, in the course of that process. We're always welcoming co-chairs who would like to help out, and I believe this is Rob Oliver's first meeting as a co-chair. He has been a regular attendee for a long time, and we welcomed him into the co-chairing circle, which meant that he comes to meetings and does stuff.
And appreciates Scrum Scale in particular. I'm really looking for this presentation.
So I came across Jon, our speaker this evening. I'm on several engineering leadership. I'm on several engineering leadership Slack groups, and someone asked a question on one of those groups about.
Te doy un palo más grande, no te lo comes, nomás lo rompes.
Yeah, we'll have to mute.
Déjame ver si lo hallo. Me acuerdo dónde lo dejé.
We'll have to mute her. So I was on one of those groups, and someone asked a question about frameworks and effectiveness in multiple, basically enterprise problematic agile. And Jon checked in and said, well, Scrum Scale actually has been pretty effective in one of the places I've been, and I'm using it again in another place. And he gave a reply that was both cogent and insightful, and caused me to raise my hand and say, Jon, would you come share a case study of what you've done? So Jon, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about a instance of Scrum at Scale at Athena Health. I'll talk to this a little bit. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of background about myself and about Athena Health. I'm going to cover the story of the case study, and I'm going to talk about, try to distill why I think it worked. Because I think as much as the headline of the story, which was that we were able to very quickly incorporate 5 times the number of teams into a scaled environment, do so within the course of a couple of sprints, and then reduce the expected time to release from 15 months to 6 months. Like, those headline numbers are pretty spectacular. They don't really tell you why it worked, though. And I think that's the important thing, is it's not Scrum at Scale is way better than any other scaling technology or framework. It is the conditions were right for the kind of scaling framework and technology that Scrum at Scale is. So I'll talk about that a little bit. I'll talk about what I learned about this, and leave time for sort of general Q&A at the end. However, at any point along the way, if anybody has a question or has a point that they want to raise, please absolutely feel free to interrupt me, and we can make this more of a conversation. We can talk through my observations here. I've got a number of them, and I did try to PowerPoint is not my strong suit, but I did try to put these things together in enough of a narrative way for us to go through and have a conversation. So, tell you a little bit about me. So I'm the director of product operations at Liberty Mutual for one of our divisions. There are many of them. I support our U.S. property and casualty business, which is the largest part of the organization. And that means that I have about 200 and 200 and change product owners, managers of product owners, CPOs who are under my care. Roughly 300, I would say about 320 teams, about 2,400 people who support the entire $28 billion business. Our budget, our tech budget is about $1 billion a year, so a little under $1 billion a year. So we have lots of heterogeneous technology. If anybody here still remembers how to do COBOL, we have openings. 100% we still do. We have 9 mainframes that we still maintain. And we also have some of the latest technology. We use everything. We've got Kubernetes, we've got AWS that we're using. We're using Azure, Google Cloud, all of it. So we have every technology you could possibly imagine. And that means that we have opportunities to try scaling and doing work in a bunch of different ways. My work has been, largely speaking, bringing product management and product mindset to the organization. Unusually, I am an Agile coach who sits on the business side. Usually Agile coaches in enterprise sit on the tech side. But my job is to yell at the business people and help them understand how they can work better with the tech people. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I've done. I have a pretty long and robust history with Agile. I've worked in many different environments. I've worked in 5 startups. I was out in San Francisco for a decade. I've worked in Boston and New York City. At one point, I had both the CIA and the NSA as clients. That's the Culinary Institute of America and the National Storytelling Association. So I've had the chance to work with a lot of different folks in a lot of different ways, supporting and setting up Scrum and Kanban teams in a number of places, but also setting up Scrum at Scale and large scale Scrum and supporting Nexus and SAFe and have had the opportunity really to see a lot of these frameworks and see what works and what doesn't work, both at the enterprise scale and a little bit below that. So I've been doing this, I've been working in tech for just about 30 years now. I started as a project manager. I've also been an engineering manager. I've been a head of product. I've sat on boards of startups. I've worked in real-time operating systems. I've worked in hardware. I've worked in firmware. I've worked in robotics, in artificial intelligence. You might say I'm the quintessential jack of all trades. I think one of my 2 sort of proudest ignominious moments, one was working for a startup where, as the head of engineering and test, I made the mistake of allowing us to go to product without actually testing the hardware. I thought simulation would be good enough. The product caught fire. So that was bad. Learned a lot from that. And the other was working for a robotics company where we were able to blow through about $300 million in funding and have nothing to show for it. So I think that's probably the most expensive learning opportunity that I know of. And I'll talk a little bit about Athena Health. So Athena Health, when I joined in 2017, was absolutely a mission-driven organization. People had shirts that said "Unbreak Healthcare." I'm working to make healthcare better, and it really was this mission that the organization was on to figure out how to make sense out of our now $3.1 trillion healthcare industry. And there were maybe 3 or 4 major pieces there that I had a hand in. So we were in the process of going from, we believed we were still hitting about 30 or 40% year-over-year growth. We were in the process of trying to go from a $1 billion organization to a $10 billion organization. And an order of magnitude scale requires some changes in technology. So we were sitting on a LAMP stack that had been around since the early 2000s, that still had code the co-founders had written. And we were moving to a bright, shiny new microservices architecture. We had set up in a new platform organization. A lot of my work was coaching that new platform organization and working with them. So I specifically worked with the identity access management group. I worked with the group that was creating the APIs for the other teams. That total tech org was probably about 1,400 people and roughly 200 teams split across Boston, Watertown, Watertown just outside of Boston, in Austin, Texas, in Bangalore, and in Chennai, with some small groups scattered elsewhere around the world. But those were the 4 main sites for the teams that we had. So the technical platform that I worked on, and that's a lot of where I spent my time, was adjacent to the 2 main products, one of which was a revenue cycle management product called Athena Clinicals, and the other, Athena Collector, and the other was a decision support software for hospitals and providers called Athena Clinicals. And that's kind of where the Scrum at Scale work that we did happen, was in that clinical section. So I'm going to stop there for a second and say, does anybody have any questions, observations before I dive into the actual case study? All right, let's get to it. So we were working on something called CERHT, which is Certified EHR, Electronic Health Records Technology, the update for 2019. So in 2015, CMS, which is the Medicare and Medicaid federal government agency, issued a set of guidelines and said, anyone who is doing electronic healthcare records, you will have a slew of new requirements that you have to meet. There'll be interop requirements, there'll be data integrity requirements, there's new PII requirements, personal information requirements. So the government basically said, as part of the ACA, as part of the Healthcare Act, you're going to need to do a lot to update and modernize the healthcare technology platform. But since it's so much work, we're going to give you 4 years to do it. You don't actually have to get it done until January of 2019. So you got 4 years, no big deal. And as a company on a super high growth path, we were highly incented to make sure we were making progress on this, but it wasn't the most important thing. We're still a very client-driven organization. So the most important thing was going after the big hospitals and making sure that we had them, making sure our other providers were happy with the work that we were doing, landing new clients, making sure that we were building in new features and beating our competitors, the normal stuff you do in a business. When you think about how important a standardized platform for interoperability of health information is, and take a step back, think about how much of a competitive differentiator that might be if everybody has to do it. And the answer is, it's really not. So from the standpoint of a product company, this doesn't look like a competitive differentiator. It looks like a tax. It's something that you just have to build. So we did spend time on it. We had a dozen teams working on this for multiple years. We didn't spend anywhere near enough time on it, anywhere near enough effort on it. One of my absolute favorite program managers, and I sat in the Agile office, which had both Agile coaches and program managers, had been responsible for this program, and she had been at the organization for almost 15 years. So she was an absolute veteran, really knew everything inside and out. Great program manager, exceedingly smart, and she had been flashing in the red, amber, green her monthly report. She'd been flashing red for a long time. And as we were talking in early 2018, she was telling me, I smell it. We're in trouble. I don't know exactly how we're in trouble, but we are in trouble. She said, this program is super red. I said, did you tell the execs that? She's like, what should I do? Just put super red on there? I'm like, yes, do that. Put super red on there. And this program is super red with the yellow background. That is what she put in her report. And that, unsurprisingly, got everyone's attention because it's really ugly. It's really visible. And people said, oh, my goodness. So that's a serious problem. What do we do about that? So the first thing we need to figure out was, how bad is it? Is it really that bad? How bad is it? We know it's bad. So we conducted a schedule audit to take a look at all the work that needed to get done. It took about 2 months, roughly 2 months. And when that audit was completed, we believed, if we had gone on the same path, that it would be about September before we finished, so 9 or 10 months after the deadline. And the cost, the expected cost in terms of not reputation, but just lost revenue, our inability to actually continue to sell the product we were making, and our inability to grab new customers was going to be something like 10% of our revenue. So give or take $100 million problem. And 100% of our profit. We would swing from being profitable to being in the red, pretty deeply in the red, if we didn't fix this. So catastrophically bad is absolutely germane and absolutely accurate for this. And the executives, to their credit, understood this to be the case and understood that this was maybe optimistic. If we didn't do anything, this is maybe optimistic. So they knew we absolutely had a lot of work to do. We needed to change something, and we needed to change something with alacrity, and we couldn't just nibble around the edges. It was going to be a big issue. So we took some pretty extraordinary measures. The first thing we did is we grabbed every team we thought could possibly work on this. So we upped the allocation of teams that were fully dedicated from 11 to just about 60. Different times are like in the mid 50s, at different times in the low 60s, but it was nearly 60 teams that were working on this. We started to probe everywhere we could for soft requirements. So we would talk to our contacts in the government. You're like, okay, so is everybody really going to do this? Is this really like, I don't know about that one. Do you really think that's going to happen? So we could start to prioritize. If we don't quite make this, are you gonna give us a passing grade even though we didn't quite meet it, or are we gonna fail on this, to try and understand where we had those? We also talked to our competitors who were not quite in the same boat, but had similar issues. We said, well, so we're supposed to be, an example was a FIRE, was a third-party interop standard. Are you really gonna do that, or are we just gonna like basically, simplifying a little bit, like, are we going to make interop happen by essentially transferring flat files back and forth to each other of patient data? And they said, yeah, that's what we're going to do. We're not going to be able to do the whole interop thing. And if everybody stands up and says we can't do the whole interop thing, then maybe nobody has to do it. Maybe we can convince the government like it's not going to happen. And that is actually the way it went. We were able to reduce some of those requirements. So we said just jack up the number of people working on it. We said, figure out the places where we could probably still kind of squeak by. And then we took the nearly unprecedented step of actually asking the program manager, what should we do? And what made it unprecedented was not just that we asked, but actually they really meant it. Tell us what you need to do to captain your program. Tell us who you need. Tell us how you're going to do this, and we will back you. Whatever you need, we will do. So we decided to take a look at Scrum at Scale. I'm going to talk just a little bit about Scrum at Scale sort of out of the box, the way it looks, and why we thought this would be a good choice for us to pattern our scaling, to use as a scaling pattern. So Scrum at Scale is very purpose designed, specifically designed to scale productivity. The way Jeff Sutherland has described it, he talks about, if you've ever seen his tagline, twice the work in half the time. If you ask him about that, what he'll tell you is he doesn't mean twice the features. What he means is collapsing the decision-making processes and collapsing the wait states between work, because the actual amount of time, being a lean guy that he is, work, wait, you collapse those wait states, you will get way more done than if you try and grind out more productivity from your developers. And that's what Scrum at Scale is designed to do. It's designed to collapse wait states and lessen cognitive load by creating self-similar, that is to say, fractal organizational patterns. So if anybody's read Mintzberg's Structure in Fives, it's an excellent, that is where Jeff got a lot of his inspiration from. And he and I have had not a ton of conversations about this, but he and I have talked about it a little bit. That's why if you look at Scrum at Scale, the teams are 5, the Scrum of Scrums is 5, like everything is 5. He's actually trying to do that. And he was very specific about using the same words, the same concepts, the same events, the same titles at every level of the Scrum at Scale hierarchy that he could. And the idea was to create that fractal self-similarity at the team level, the level above it, all the way up to the executive action team and the executive meta Scrum team. The reason for that is if everybody's speaking the same language, and if everybody's working the same way, and everybody's focused on the same goals, then your ability to make decisions becomes is greatly increased, and your ability to do so with alacrity is also greatly increased. And that really was sort of specifically what he was trying to do with Scrum at Scale. So before I go on, I'll stop there again and say, does anybody have any questions about Scrum at Scale and how it works? Does this gel with anybody else's experience? Does it feel different for anybody?
So what other frameworks did you consider? How did you cross-evaluate them? And so maybe this is coming up, but how did you cross-evaluate them? And how did you know that Scrum at Scale was what you wanted to do?
Yeah, chef's kiss. That is the next slide.
I do have a question on the
Please.
previous slide. You mentioned about five people for each team and 5 people for Scrum at Scale. How do you enforce 5? There is no way in any organization I've been part of that you can just restrict it to 5. There are so many players, they want to be part of it, and they get upset if they're not part of, these either in some way or fashion. And then it becomes a political nightmare managing the whole.
Oh, yeah. So we did mostly 5s, right? So what we said is, this is the goal. We want to have teams of 5. However, there were teams, especially when we were talking about our Bangalore teams tended to be much larger. They were 9, 10, sometimes 11 or 12 person teams. And we said, if it's more than 8, you must split your team for this effort. But if it's 8 or below, we'll live with it. It's okay. It's not ideal, but it's okay. If you would like to split your team, we will coach you through the process of creating smaller teams. Then you have a team of 4. It's still okay. It's a team of 4. It's not 5. And so that was for us, that was the compromise we made around the framework. When you talk to, the last time I talked to Jeff about structure in 5s, he said, look, it's all about the same thing everybody says. It's about network complexity. It's about, how many different, nodes you have of communication points, and 5 is the optimal number for humans. It's absolutely the optimal number, 5. If you've ever talked to Jeff, he's very emphatic. He's very definitive. This is it. There's data. This is the number. It's 5. 5 is a number. Can you do 6? 6 is not optimal. Can you do 6? Yes, you can do 6, but it's not optimal. What about 4? 4 is not optimal because the system is, so it has a degree of fragility broken into it because you need 5. 5 is the magic number. Like, okay, but if I have a team of 4, will that work? You could do it, but it should be 5. So that's because I've had enough experience with having him back in the day when he actually still used to run certified Scrum Master classes. I had him as my trainer, and then for Scrum at Scale, my Scrum at Scale practitioner certification, he came in pretty frequently, and because he's here in Boston, I've had a chance to talk to him. I can tell you that if you approach him at a conference, he will tell you it's got to be 5. You figure out a way around that. Like, the impediment for you is that your organization is dumb and you have to fix it. But if you actually press him on it, he'll say, you could have a team of 6 or 7, you could do that. But the whole point is to create this fractal self-similarity that removes the thinking around that. So the more you smooth that out, the more things look the same, the easier it is for you to do. And that's what we did, is we said, we're going to create a couple of, you think about them as guardrails and guidelines. The guardrail was 8 is the magic number. Any larger than 8, you must split your team. The guideline was try to get to 5. See if you can get to 5. If you can do that, that's going to be much better for you. Just trust us. Really smart people have thought about this. 5 is the magic number, but we didn't get there all the time.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. So, Ron, to your question, why not safe? Why not less? Why not disciplined agile? Why not, well, Rage wasn't around then. Why not any line? Why not just a regular Scrum of Scrums? Why didn't we do any of those things? We were super fortunate in that because it was a large organization that was also had a high degree of autonomy, we were trying all kinds of stuff. Not unlike Liberty, but we were trying all kinds of things. So I had set up SAFE in our IT group. And the reason I set up SAFE, we had a single ART of 6 teams. I set that up because our HR and finance operations both fed into the same 6 teams. And they continually were asking for things. And when they didn't get what they wanted, they would escalate. So you would end up having the CPO, the Chief People Officer, going to an engineer and saying, where is my feature? I need my feature. So we set up SAFE to allow the platforms that they were working on, platforms like PeopleSoft, to allow them to say, here is the roadmap for the long-term things we need to do. You need to give us some time to work on this. Let's agree a priori at the beginning of the quarter, 10-week quarter, 5-sprint quarter, that this is what we're going to do. We're going to spend 60% of our time servicing your ad hoc requests, but we're going to spend 40% of our time working on these longer term features. So what we needed there was a high degree of transparency. What we needed there was for people to be able to queue up the work rationally. What we needed there was for a high degree of trust to be established that we can be predictable, we can get stuff done. March forward, tick, 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 tick. SAFE worked for that purpose. We used large-scale Scrum in our platform teams. And the reason that we did that is our platform teams had architects as their product owners. We had one architect who was supporting 7 or 8 teams. So I sat down with him and he's like, I'm like, how are you doing this? How are you possibly creating a backlog for 7 teams? That sounds crazy. Sounds like crazy town. I don't know how you're doing that. And he's like, I'm not. I can't. Like, I just kind of like, I walk in, I make sure that they're kind of doing what they need to do. Sometimes I go to their events, not too often, but mostly I just work with their managers. I can't do it. I said, okay, well, why don't we use a construct out of less called the area product owner? And we'll make sure there's an area product owner for each one of the teams. So what you're going to do is you're going to give us the initiative and the epic level, so the bigger piece and then the epic piece. And you're going to help us understand that they're going to do a lot of the individual team stuff. And you're going to do, when we do the sprint planning 1 and we do the sprint review 1, where we look at the system that those teams are working in. So in this case, identity access management, or our API development team, or our or the team that was working on the underlying, some of the underlying infrastructure as a service, code as deploy that we were working on. There were maybe 2 or 3 or 4 teams involved in each one of those areas. They would be set up as a little less installation. And we would say, as an architect, your job is to make sure that that planning 1 and that review 1 and that retro 1 are happening properly. The planning 2, the retro 2, and the review 2, which are the individual team ones, those will happen with the area product owners. And the area product owner was a reasonably seasoned engineer on the team who then played the role of product owner for that team. So less flavored, worked quite well for those teams. And for a couple of reasons. One of them is it relieved the pressure on the architects who were trying to write user stories. And we're like, I can't write 400 user stories every 2 weeks. Like, it's just too much. The other is that because less is a extremely product focused scaling framework, it allowed our folks in the platform who were naturally inclined in many cases to think about the technology, the scale that we needed to achieve, the CTO coming in and saying, we're going to have to run, 10x transactions through this thing. So are you thinking about that? It helped reorient their thinking to these teams who sit above you are asking for these things. What do you need to do in order to make sure that you're giving them a good developer experience? These teams or these companies who are third parties who are going to be using our platform, they are looking at sending in feature requests to us. How are you going to make sure that you are servicing those feature requests? So we looked at those and we said, well, safe is great for the transparency, the protecting the teams, the sort of creating that connectivity for executives to be able to understand, because it's sort of like it's like a waterfall agile mullet, if you will. It's kind of waterfall up top and like agile in the back. Less is really good if you need people to be thinking about and oriented around a product, and you want to either double down on or help reinforce the fact that they need to be thinking about their customers, their products. Really good framework for that. Scrum at Scale is really, really good if you need to speed development and align people's priorities. So that's the way we were thinking about it when we were thinking about scaling technology and what we were going to use. So what did we do? We leaned heavily into the Scrum Master cycle side of SAFe. And you can see here the little, like, you got your 5 of 5s, right? So there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 big boxes. There's 5 little ones around here, right? So it's structure in 5s. He's no joke. He was very serious about that. And we reasonably-ish replicated that. The true magic of this was being able to get our head of product, our VP of product, and our VP of engineering to set aside 11:30 to 12 every Tuesday and Thursday without fail. That was the number one thing that made everything else work. We had to do that. They had to agree to it, and they had to do it without fail. And they did. They were willing to do that. That meant that even though we had a 9:30 Scrum of Scrums, which if you work in Bangalore sucks, and a 10:30 Scrum of Scrums, which if you work in Bangalore sucks even more. If you were in Austin, which is Central Time, 9:30 is 8:30, which just doesn't suck all that badly, except when you consider that most of those guys came in at around 11. So we were asking them to get up 2.5 hours early to report out the work that they were doing and be able to help kind of like storm and form around these groups. And I think, Gopal, you probably would have a similar question. Did you really have 5 people or 5 teams in each one of these groupings? The answer is not always. We did not always have 5 teams. The teams were grouped around. We tried to keep them there was a grouping of 7. There was one grouping of 7. All the other ones were 4 or 5. And they were grouped around specific technologies and bodies of work that we were trying to get done. So like we did it basically by where you are going to be interacting as a team. You were one of those, you were in the scrum of scrums. So what this allowed us to do was twice a week, we were able to get to our main decision makers, the head of product and the VP of engineering, and be able to say, here's a problem that we have, we need you to solve it. Or here's a problem that we have and we don't know how to solve it and we don't know what to do about it. EAT stands for Executive Action Team. So the Executive Action Team in Scrum at Scale is your highest level decision maker for the system. And the Executive Action Team is the team that has all the authority to make whatever changes need to be made in order to get done what you need to get done. So that is generally speaking going to be your C-suite folks. So that was for us, that was our CEO, CTO, and Chief Product Officer in this case, not Chief People Officer, our CPO. So on Friday, we had, I want to say, 12 to 12:30 they were always available, and sometimes 12 to 1, and we almost never had to go there. We were almost always able to say with our VP levels, this is what we need to have happen, and they were almost always able to help us. There were a couple of times we had to go to the C-suite, but pretty rarely. And the fact that we were able to do that generated even more urgency and even more desire at the team level and above for people to solve their own problems. So you couldn't just wait and be like, well, I guess the problem will be solved next sprint. Oh, I don't know, we'll kick it to these folks. Oh, I guess we have to wait for it here. Because people knew if you didn't, it was going to go to the VP the next day. And if we still didn't have a solution, it was going to go to the CEO of the company at the end of the week. And I'll tell you a little story about the CEO of the company at the time. His name is also Jonathan. And he would sometimes just pop into Jira, take a look at what teams were doing, and call an individual engineer or call an individual product owner or call an individual engineering manager and go, hey, it's Jonathan. I have a question about this thing that you're working on, which was super cool and fine when the company was 50 people. And it was really, really not cool when the company was 4,000 people. People would be like, who the heck is this Jonathan guy who's calling me? Like, oh my God, that's Jonathan Bush. That's the founder and CEO of the company. That's the cousin of George H.W. Bush, who was the president. He's calling me right now. It's 11 p.m. and he wants to know what's happening with a story in my backlog. What do I say? So we actually, we were able to turn what was not great executive behavior into a pretty good goad where we were able to say, don't make us go to Friday with this. Let's not do that. And the VPs as well, they also didn't want to do it, right? They didn't want to have to deal with the C-levels saying, well, why couldn't you solve this problem? Unless it was a problem they really could not solve. So this collapsed our decision-making time. Instead of taking days or weeks for us to figure out, should these teams be retasked into this effort? Should we fix this bug or should we do this? Is it okay if we're using an old piece of technology, even though our go forward is something different? Should we be asking these clients should we be exposing some of the things we're doing to these clients so we can get some feedback on it, even though that means we're running a risk of them potentially going, oh, you folks don't have your stuff together. Maybe we should jump onto another platform, right? So there were real serious business and technical concerns that we were looking at. And people felt far more empowered and felt far more urgency to answer those questions so that they didn't have to have either the VPs or the C-suite folks do. Questions or thoughts about this?
When I look at the drawing on the right, is that a drawing of your organization?
No, that is a drawing that comes directly from Scrum at Scale.
Okay, so if we looked at, so the Scrum and Scale one, is that 125 people or is that 125 teams?
Teams.
That's 125 teams. So you only had
100.
60.
Right.
60.
So we had, you have basically one of these. Scrum of Scrums was as high as we went.
And so there were 5 Scrum of Scrums. And 1 Scrum of Scrums.
That's right.
Okay. And the 5, and so when you were talking about 5 people on a team, we're talking about 5 engineers or 3 engineers and a product owner and a Scrum Master, or
5 engineers and or 3 engineers and 2 testers and or 4
Sure.
engineers and 1 designer, etc.
Yep.
A product owner who was considered like extra to the team. So the team might be 6 people. When you get to the Scrum of Scrums, it was the product owner and either an engineer or the Scrum Master, who in our case was also the engineering manager. It's one of the few places I've seen engineering managers function as Scrum Masters and actually work sometimes. They were the ones who would come to the Scrum of Scrums. At the Scrum of Scrums, then you would have 10 to 12 people. The Scrum of Scrums would be
10 to 12 people, sorry.
1 or 2 from each team.
1 or 2 and 2 would be the Scrum Master / engineering manager and
Product owner.
product owner. Got it.
So the team would meet, they go, we have this issue. Then the product owner, engineer, for simplicity's sake, the product owner Scrum Master would come to the Scrum of Scrums with 4 other sets. And they would say, we have this issue. And then they would go to the Scrum of Scrums. The Scrum of Scrums was the group that talked about, it was a group that included architects and our overall heads of UX and our overall head of product and our product operations folks. So it's a little bit different in that a Scrum of Scrums in Scrum at Scale is still the representative of the teams that just keeps laddering up. When we got to Scrum of Scrums, we brought in outside people who were experts and were able to deliver some context so that we could package something up for the VP of product and the VP of engineering and say, we've talked to the architects, we've talked to the client services folks. We believe this is the thing that we need to do, and we need you to unlock this for us.
And so the additional people were architects and client services people, or there were more. So you went through that fast.
Sorry. Depended on which Scrum of Scrums you were talking about. You can think about it as we brought in the external people for that area who were needed to be able to package up and make a good decision. So in one of the Scrum of Scrums areas, some of the Scrum of Scrums areas, you might have an architect who understands the underlying data structure. You might have the client services person who are looking at for a particular client we're supposed to be piloting with. You might have the person who they were all, sorry, I didn't say this either. They were all on call for the Scrum of Scrums. So they didn't always attend every single one of them. Now I'm thinking about our friend who did who was our primary government liaison, also was on call at that point. So we would say, we have a question. Can we ask the government about this?
So the
Or
extra
do you already
folks
have the
were,
answer?
the extra folks were SMEs.
Yes.
And John, do you feel like that was or was that you were bringing in subject matter experts like every other day, every other week, depending on what the needs were, and it was kind of an evolving group, or were they like, hey, I'm here every Tuesday and Thursday or whatever?
The architects were there every day.
Right. They were like, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the architects were there pretty much every day. Trying to think about the other folks. The client services folks, for the first month or so, everyone was there every day. So it was just giant conversation of like 25 people sitting in the room.
Yeah.
And then it thinned out once we figured out what we needed, and people would just either they would be in their offices doing work, since we were all in person. They'd be in their offices doing work, and they would come down if we needed them. So it'd be like somebody be like, hey, can you come down? We have this question for you. On
Cool.
occasion, we would know ahead of time. But this is one of the beauties of the system, is that it is supposed to be just in time, right? Your scrum of scrums, any one of those scrums of scrums could say, we have this issue, and that should be able to bubble up within an hour to the next group. And that should be able to bubble up within 2 days to the VP level. So that instead of having to wait to make sure that you're like, well, what about, when is that architect going to be available to have a conversation? Can we do this? Can we do this? We're able to get that done every day. So every day you got this SMEs were available if you needed them.
Cool.
Some of them hated it. Because
And
we like, some
I
of
was
them
just
hated it. They're
wondering-
like, you can't meet at this time. You cannot have any other meeting at this time.
not to get too much in the weeds, the timing is about an hour. Could you have tightened it up to every half hour as Sutherland purports, or maybe within every 15 minutes? Would that be too much?
So the actual meetings were half an hour. There was a half an hour in between,
Yeah.
and that was the oh shit time. That was like, oh, okay, we're about to have this conversation. We need to get our stuff together before we have the conversation at
Yeah.
the next level.
Get
right?
it. Yeah.
Most of the conversations were half an hour. If we had been so inclined, maybe we could have tightened it up to 15 minutes. I think it would have been pretty difficult.
Yeah.
If these were permanent structures, like if we had said, you 5 teams will always work together and you 25 teams will always work together, if that had been the case, we might have been able to get it down to close to 15 minutes.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
All right. So the other side, someone should talk to Jeff about naming. Executive meta scrum is the other side. This is the product owner cycle. This is the how do you make sure that all your product owners for all the teams, all the way up to the chief product owner, all the way up to the CEO are aligned, right? So he's got that meta scrum CPO, and then the CCPO, which is the chief product owner of the meta scrum, right? So as it goes up, you just add more C's. So you just have many chiefs, and that's the way that this is designed to work. So again, right, it's in 5. So 5 POs meet together, and they were supposed to meet in the meta scrum with the CPO, and then 5 CPOs would meet with the CCPO, right? So the idea, again, it's this idea of structure in 5s, this idea of fractal. It's this idea that you have the same structure on the product side that you have on the engineering side. It reduces the cognitive load. Go ahead, Ron.
There's one product owner for 5 teams.
1 product owner per team, 1 CPO for 5 teams.
Okay.
So we didn't do this. This looked like when the program manager and I talked about this, and we sat down and looked at what we needed, we went back to first principles. What is the purpose of this cycle? Why does the executive meta scrum exist? And it exists to very quickly align priorities and value across multiple teams up to the overall value and vision that the organization is trying to create. We didn't need that. We knew what we needed to get done. We had to fulfill the government's requirements. We had to make sure executive leadership was on board. That was the overriding thing we needed to do. And while there was a little bit of wiggle room in scope, there wasn't a lot. There also wasn't a lot of discovery that needed to happen because the requirements had been set 3 years before. So there were good reasons for us to do the Scrum Master cycle. There were not good reasons for us to implement this cycle, and so we didn't. But we did take a look at what we needed out of our product folks, out of the folks who are setting the prioritization for the organization. And the biggest thing that we needed was to ensure that we had product and release feedback from CMS, from the government. So we wanted to be able to say, this is what we're doing. Does this actually meet your requirements? Yes or no? And so that we actually did. We had monthly reviews with them in order to be able to do that. They were big and cumbersome and onerous, and we had a Gantt chart for them because they could view Gantt charts and understand them, and they couldn't understand backlogs. We did have some discovery items in there, but they weren't tracked with a huge amount of rigor. There's like, we put them in there. And we did use Initiative's epic story as the structure for our requirementing, going from kind of top to bottom. So, Scott, the PO and SM are not considered part of the team of 5. They would be in Jeff Sutherland's thinking, but in Jeff Sutherland's thinking, the Scrum Master is often not, it's often a role, not a job. Developers were, yes, the whole team was 100% allocated to the project, and nothing else. So that is one of the things that, I am also a stickler for when implementing scaling. It's very, very difficult to have developers on teams working on a team, but then also working on something on the side. So that team, if that team is split across multiple things, it's not great, but it's okay. If you split your developers and say 80% of the time you're working on this team stuff, but 20% of the time you're working on something else, that's a really, really hard way to make things work. Yes, that's what I meant. Henri Gantt's charts. That is just a typo. Some big organizations that have implemented Scrum Scale in their organization, I don't know. I don't know of anybody else who's done it. I recall Schlumberger was talking about doing it, big oil services company, but I don't know if they ever actually got around to it.
Rob, you've got experience with Scrum Scale. Any insight into that question?
I'm looking right now on the Scrum Scale website. I don't see anything offhand. I'll post it in chat if I find it.
Super, thank you.
I do recall thinking at the time in 2018, this is going to be extremely difficult for an enterprise to implement. And the reason that I think it's difficult for an enterprise to implement is enterprises, this is really designed to completely focus and collapse your decision making and make things really, really, really fast and orient you around one thing and one thing only. That's what the executive Metascrum is designed to do. It just funnels all of this stuff up to a single point of decision making and then funnels it back all the way down. In most enterprises, there is not a single point of decision making. There are nodes of decision making, some of which have more control and some of which have less control in different areas. So it becomes very difficult to see how you would implement this organization-wide. You could certainly implement it in an area where you have a very strong executive who has a very strong executive partner, and the 2 of them or the 3 of them or the 4 of them have good control over an entire business unit. That I think is doable. And if you were trying to get your organization to collapse decision making, then this would be a decent pattern to go after.
John, just as a contextual question, can you throw out like one requirement from the government from 4 years earlier that gives me a sense of how big those requirements were?
So there were a set of clinical decision efficacy requirements that you needed. So as an example, it would be something along the lines of, for any given treatment, you need to have 13 questions that get asked at the point in which the physician is diagnosing, and then another 30 days later, and then another 30 days after that. And so for any of these, trying to think, it's like heart attack or myocardial infarction, they would take a look and they would say, at this point, if you're going to crack somebody's chest open and do open heart surgery, you need to have asked these questions before the surgery.
We're leaving within 15 minutes. Oops, sorry.
Oh, okay. Then 6 weeks later, you need to ask these questions and take a look at efficacy at this point. And then 6 months after that, you have to do this. So the way individual hospitals and individual practitioners had did it was largely the same, but now there were really strict guidelines on this. And so we had to take all of the forms that took information for every single treatment that Medicare and Medicaid covered, for every drug interaction, and make them comport to all of those rules.
And I presume there were a few of those.
Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, right? And these were the kinds of things you couldn't get wrong. It wasn't like, we got close, we almost did it, right? This is the kind of thing where that's where the audits would come in, and that's why I was really glad not to have to do that. It was like 8 or 9 hours of mind-numbing audits where they would just go through and they would be like, show me this on the screen, now show me this in the data, now show me this on the screen, now show me this in the data, tick, 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 tick. Did you implement this? Did you implement this? Did you implement this? And that's where we really got a sense of the degree of rigor they were looking at. In some cases, they were like, this we don't care about as much. In many cases, it was, we said within 30 to 35 days. We didn't mean 30 to 35 business days. We meant 30 to 35 calendar days. That's not specified, but that's what we mean. It should be obvious. That's what you need to do. We go, shit, okay. You mean calendar days, not business days. Is there any other place where we have business day logic, not calendar day logic? Because we moved over that code from a place that was doing bill collection, and it was great. It works perfectly, except it's got the wrong stuff, except for federal holidays. Okay, wait, what? So calendar days except for federal holidays? Be like, oh, okay, all right. So there was lots of stuff like that where we'd have to go through, really understand what the code was doing in various different places so that we can understand why it wasn't working exactly the way it was supposed to work.
Interesting question at the end of the chat from Amin.
Would implementation require a full-blown reorganizing structure, or slow implementation is viable? Say more, Amin. What do you mean by that?
So my question is, if considering implementing Scrum at scale as the implementation within the organization, does it require complete turnover on the structure within the big organization as going forward, or can it slowly be implemented from bottom up or from top to down, as in like changing the teams to Scrum and slowly implementing over time?
Jeff would tell you that there's no point in doing this if your executive team is not going to snap everybody to the structure. That shouldn't surprise anyone given what I've said about Jeff, but like he'd be like, no, if you don't have your executive action team, if you don't have your meta scrum going, don't even bother. I would say you want to have the sort of like, if you look at everybody who needs to build a thing, and everybody who needs to prioritize a thing, and everyone who makes the decisions about what you're building and prioritizing, which you could loosely call a product. If everybody in that chain is on board, you could implement it that way. Scrum at Scale doesn't require you to change job titles, job functions, or any of that stuff. Scrum at Scale 100% requires you to be doing Scrum. So if you're not doing Scrum, Scrum at Scale is going to be really difficult to make work because it's built and layered on top of that. You could, however, build a reference implementation, which is one of the things that he recommended. But the way he recommended building a reference implementation is go talk to your CEO, get your CEO on board, build a reference implementation, carve out a protected space for them, show how it works in the whole organization, and then scale everybody. So slow implementation, probably not. You do need to have like the entire, it is the boundaries of decision making for all of the people who are involved in creating some end-to-end value, that's the minimum thing that you need to do. But that doesn't have to be the whole entire organization. It doesn't have to actually be everybody in the company. It could be like if I were, I'm gonna use a dumb example, but like if I were thinking about IBM, it could just be the client services group that does that. So that's a 450,000 person company. You could just do it with 90,000 to start.
That brings me to a follow-up question. What are the first, second, and third step of implementation of a Scrum at scale at an organization that has not familiarized with the Scrum at scale?
What are the first, second, and third steps? Is that what you
Yes.
asked?
Like, because you mentioned the entire organization need to become a Scrum at scale, right? So how would be approach for that? As in, we get everybody in the room and tell them we're at Scrum at scale, or they need to be educated, as in having classes or individually being coached.
Yes, mostly yes. So I think the first thing is, and let me try and recall what we did. We got everybody who was going to be involved in the room, and we had the executives say, this is absolutely serious. This is a company threatening program. If we don't get this right, we are 100% behind this. This is what we're going to do. Turned it over to me and my program manager partner and said, what is it we're doing here? So we didn't say, go look at the Scrum at Scale website. What we said is, here's what we're doing. Here are the patterns. Here's why we're doing them. Here's where the meetings are set up. Here's what's going to be expected from you. Here's the places we're going to test and learn, iterate, understand, and adapt how we think this is going to work. But make no mistake, this is mandatory. This is a thing that we're doing, and you're going to start doing it next week. So you have all this week to wrap your stuff up, finish up your sprint, and then boom, we're going. So step one, I think, is you need your executives to let people know this is what we're doing. There's no backpedaling. There's no soft selling this. That's not step number one. Step number two is you give people the structure so they know what is expected of them before they understand the why. So if you think about it as the shoe state, you're going to come to these meetings, you're going to do this, you're going to present this stuff. And then you also provide, so you can also think about that as Ron Heifetz's challenge and support. If you haven't read The Practice of Adaptive Leadership, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, sort of this like challenge and support. Then you provide gobs of support. You must do these things. We have to do this. This is absolutely imperative for the organization. And we will help you figure out how to run a scrum of scrums, and we'll help you figure out how we're going to do this. And we'll make sure that that you feel comfortable presenting to the VPs and to the C-levels where you need to. And we'll make sure that we have a good view into the code, and we'll make sure that we have the right subject matter experts, and right. So those are kind of steps 1, 2, and 3 that we used. I don't know that that's the only way to do it, but that's the way we did it.
So it does seem to me like I'm trying to imagine most large organizations' willingness to adapt this, and it seems like the catastrophic thing is possibly the only driver.
If you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, his paper on prospect theory is what he won his Nobel Prize for. It's a paper, so it's not as exciting as a book. It's not as much fun to read as a book, but it is really interesting. And the TLDR of that is people fear loss more than they anticipate and go for gain. So you are absolutely right that it is much, much, much harder to do the moonshot thing and say like, we're going to do this. It's going to be amazing. If when we do, everybody's going to have rainbows, kittens, and puppies. Like, it's going to be awesome. That's much harder than to say, if we don't do this, we are all going to die, right? So getting people on board with a burning platform is much easier than saying, it's going to be so great when we do this. Why don't you join me in this amazing new world? I happen to think if you can do that, you get better results. You have happier people. You have people with more of a growth mindset. They have less of a scarcity mindset. They're really thinking about and enrolled in making sure that things work better. But it's way harder, way harder. Michael asks, could we have delivered without adopting a scaled framework? Yes, I think so. I think we could have nudged our way there with the really smart people in the architecture and leadership positions working 100-hour weeks to tell us what we needed to do, and the engineers working 100-hour weeks doing what they needed to do. That's one other thing I'll say about this is people worked a little harder than they normally did. So 50-hour weeks were pretty common at Athena at the time. People were working 55, 60-hour weeks on this, but not 100-hour weeks. So I do think you could have done the more is more approach. More code, more unit testing, more executive oversight, more architectural oversight, sucked in a few more people. Maybe you would have had a similar result. Maybe it would have been slightly worse. But I do think by hook or by crook, it was enough of a company threat in the event that without the scaling pattern like this, we almost certainly would have come up with some solution. Yeah, this is what we did. And it did work. And I think that that's the thing I think we were proudest of is that last piece that people definitely felt like, yes, we did. We added 50 something teams. So we quintupled the size of the teams working on that effort. But I think what we were most proud of is we stopped doing other things and we did work harder, but we didn't drive people into the ground to get this done. All right, so why did it work? Number one, and these are numbered in order of what I think are importance. It was a burning platform. Like really, we had to do it. And it wasn't an executive saying, boy, we really need to do this because if we don't, terrible things will happen. It was really clear. Everybody understood it. It didn't need a translation between tech and business. Like, well, what does it really mean when this happens? Everybody really understood it. The program manager who I worked with was not an agilist, but she became one and really embraced this and said, I get it. This works. I'm seeing it, and was a huge champion for it. And with her gravitas across the organization was really able to make this happen. And kind of to your point, Michael, we didn't have a solution pattern. It's not like people went, oh, well, we could do this instead. So even though those of us in the program office evaluated multiple different ways of thinking about this, should we use some other scaling pattern? Should we do something else? It wasn't like the executives had a robust debate about, should we do this or this? We said, no, this is the way we're going to do it. And nobody went, actually, I have a better idea. Everybody went, I don't have any other ideas. Let's do this. That made it a lot easier. It's sort of like a burn the ships approach. It's like, what are we going to do? This is what we're going to do. And I think, all of these are important, even though I think the number 4 is the least important. The organizational DNA supported risk-taking and pivoting. The original vision for Athena was a birthing clinic. It was actually a series of brick and mortar clinics where women could go and have babies. That was the whole company for about 3 years. And the reason that the revenue cycle management software was built was because they were having a really hard time figuring out how to encode the right stuff for insurance companies to pay them. And once they figured that out and they created a pretty robust rules engine, they realized, oh boy, this is a business. We can actually go to providers, we can go to doctors and hospitals and say, let us collect the revenue for you. We'll take X% off the top, but we will deal with all that stuff. We will deal with all the revenue collection, and we'll make sure you have all the information you need for every insurance company. So anything that you support, we will do. So it was a major, major pivot from the original vision of what the organization was going to be. And the company really had that in there. The people that were brought in early on, and even through the period when I was there, when it was thousands of people, if you were not highly risk tolerant, it was going to be very difficult for you to survive there. And a few of my takeaways. I've alluded to it. We've talked about it quite a bit tonight. But really it's think about what is the tool that you need, right? So that old saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. True. But if you have an entire toolbox, it's a lot easier for you to be able to think about other things that you could do and other ways that you could solve those problems. So expanding your toolbox, expanding the organization's toolbox is a really critical way of being able to ensure that you are able to apply the right patterns and you are able to think about that. And that can mean, and I've been reasonably successful at this at Liberty, seeding different areas and saying, you know, your 300 something teams, your 3-team area might actually do pretty well with Nexus. You might want to look into that. You might want to take a look at McChrystal's team of teams concept and think about that. That might actually be a better way for you to go. You folks, have you heard of team topologies? You might want to think about that. So you kind of like seed these different tools and toolkits and ways of thinking about how organizations structure and function. If you can seed those with smart people across the organization, you're going to have a large toolbox that you can draw from that'll allow you, with that sort of diversity of thought, to build what you need. The second is, almost always out of the box, your toolkit is not going to be correct. It will not fit your organization. It just won't. You're going to have to modify it. And the real trick is, how do you make sure that you modify it without breaking it? And that is super hard to do. It's an art. That's why Agile is iterative and adaptive, because you have to figure your way through that. I've implemented SAFe 4 times. I, largely speaking, do not recommend implementing SAFe, but it's worked twice, and twice it was a terrible failure. Modifying your tools is super, super important. And last but not least, and these are bulleted, not numbered for that reason, always be learning. We incorporated feedback along the way. This is not the structure we started with. This is not exactly the way we started. We incorporated feedback along the way from retrospectives, from talking to our representatives at CMS, from our clients, from the architects, from the teams that were not part of this effort but were being affected by it, from our executives, from other coaches, from other program managers. We continued to iterate and adapt as much as we could. It was super frustrating because we thought, boy, we think we got this dialed in. And almost every day for like multiple months, we were like, wow, we messed up something big. Got to fix this. Like, do we need to fix this? We're not really sure. Boy, should we wait? Let's wait a sprint. Let's put that on the backlog. We'll put that, this one we got to fix right away though. I think I got to go talk to the CTO. No, I don't need to talk to the CTO. I'll talk to the VP of Edge. That's probably good enough. These were the conversations we had over and over, but it was also exhilarating because we really felt like we were making a difference. We really felt like we were learning, and we felt like the teams were engaged, the teams were learning. And I think those were my takeaways from using and adapting Scrum at scale with this organization. It was a great and terrible experience.
John, a great question from Audrey there in the chat. You may have answered her second one, I'm not sure, but what she asked about team morale and retention as a result of it during that project, I'm sure. During
the project, yeah. During the project, people were psyched. They were proud. They were saving the company. everyone talked about it. You had direct access to C levels and VP levels. Morale was sky high in that group. People were like, we are doing the right, we are saving the company. I left Athena right before, like a month or two before we ended up actually shipping this, and the company got bought by another company, and they discontinued almost everything that we did. So they unwound all of this. I don't know if this would have been the right pattern to use anyway. I can't say that for sure, but I can say for sure that when Verisk Health, which was part of GE, comes in and buys you, the likelihood is you're not going to do something like this. And yes, I can. What else can I tell you?
John, what happened after? Once everyone had big hurrah and like, wow, we did it. Did you all just, all right, back to normal business? I mean,
Josh, what a great question. I was not there for that, so I have the hearsay secondhand information. A couple of things happened. One was the massive after the circus sweeping up of technical debt that we created, and client reputation. Like, so we sucked like 50% of the 20 something percent of the organization was suddenly tasked onto this thing, which meant they weren't doing other stuff. We had angry clients. We had our platform plans like fell behind because a lot of the platform folks were working on this. There were all kinds of things that just didn't happen. And so a vast majority of what they were working on just was cleaning stuff up. The other thing that happened, which is certainly interacting with, but not directly related to this, is the organization was acquired. And so in that acquisition, new stuff happened, which, like I said, probably unrelated. So a lot of what happened at that was two executive teams came in, which means one executive team leaves. So you had executive team Thunderdome, and some people were exited from the organization, and some groups were entirely exited from the organization as well. And other groups were brought in from one org and replaced the other, and some of them were merged.
When you scaled from 20 something, 30 something up over to 60 teams ish, with all those internal people, and were they like, all right, now you're in a new role? Like, I'm just curious about like the change of having to step into a role, a new team, whatever.
Largely speaking, we moved whole teams.
Okay, yeah.
So that I think was one of the things that allowed us to move really quickly. Is we're like, okay, well, you're a team, you're working in roughly the same technology and roughly the right area, but you were working on other stuff. Okay, now you're going to do this. So there was some disruption, but because we didn't like atomize the teams and then pull the ball back together again, we moved whole teams for the most part. There was a lot less disruption.
And my other question is about the scrums and scrums. Was that a structured event in terms of we're going through, what I mean, it sounds like you were just bringing, here's a blocker. It was focused on impediments, blockers, issues. Was there any like, I've heard, is my team about to put anything in front of your team, things like that?
Absolutely. Very, very typical, and really patterned on the, if you've ever seen, not such a terrible name, but Scrum Plop, the public library of patterns. So if you look at the Scrum Plop definition of Scrum of Scrums, very, very typical of that. What are we doing that's interacting with each other? What do you need to know about what my team is doing? And the Scrum of Scrums, each Scrum of Scrums settled into their patterns reasonably quickly. They got pretty good at that. The Scrum of Scrums was really hard. because it's really hard to get representatives of several hundred people aligned on what you should talk about in a 30-minute period. Super duper hard. We eventually got pretty good at it, but there were lots of times where it was a lot like a stand-up. We're just like, I think you two need to talk. I think I need to talk to her, and she needs to talk to him. And then who needs to be in that conversation? So a lot of it was more like a stand-up, and then later in the day, the actual Scrum of Scrums conversation would happen. Like we wouldn't know what we needed to do. So there might be a day lag where the next Scrum of Scrums, people would come back and be like, we talked, we're cool, no big deal. Or we talked, we needed 7 of you in the room and they were not there. And oh, by the way, since the people representing those 4 teams were not the right engineers to represent those 4 teams, I actually need to pull in people who are not in the Scrum of Scrums into the next Scrum of Scrums. So there were places where things didn't just flow like boom, 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 all the way up to the executives and all the way back down in some, perfect halcyon way. There are a lot of places where we're like, whose chocolate is in whose peanut butter again? I'm not exactly sure what we're doing here. This doesn't make a lot of sense. Does anybody even know? I described it as it was like a human TCP/IP network, right? So it's like, where does anybody know? Does anybody know the answer to this question? Oh, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's over there. Like, oh, cool. Okay, over here, people. Do you know what the answer to this question is? Yeah, it's him. And that just took a while to figure out.
Michael has a question in the chat.
Yeah, say more, Michael. What do you mean by a typical Scrum cycle?
Well, Michael's a typist, so it may take a little bit of response time.
Okay.
Your question. Any other questions in the meantime while we're waiting for elaboration from Michael? Oh, there's his elaboration.
So the Scrum Master cycle is really this Scrum of Scrums cycle. There was it's not like less where you have like multiple teams planning sprints together, multiple teams doing other ceremonies together. The one thing that we did do was Scrum of Scrums retros. We did not do Scrum of Scrums retros. But that was the extent of the Scrum Master cycle as we implemented it.
And so that's interesting. The Scrum of Scrum retros, that was first of all, like roughly how many people, and then in a room
Roughly
together.
10.
And okay, good. And then was that primarily focused on how effective are we being as a team? How do we need to adjust this process? Like, what are some of the things that came out of those?
Those were primarily focused on tuning the Scrum of Scrums. So if you think about like the whole purpose of each, it's like the Scrum of Scrums is supposed to be 5 people. We had 10, right? Because we did 2 representatives from the team. So sometimes there were 8, sometimes there were 9. Sure. But the whole idea is that Scrum of Scrums and that Scrum of Scrums, which was supposed to be 1 representative from the Scrum of Scrums. So you have a Scrum Master, if you were doing Scrum Masters, who might be at a team and then at the SOS and then the SOSOS, right? So that person might be your representative going all the way up. We didn't quite do it that way. So where we were having Scrum of Scrums retros, it was tuning the Scrum of Scrums process. How are we functioning as a cross-functional team of teams? Like, what do we need to bring to the table? What are our artifacts looking like? What are the impediments that we have in order to be able to do our jobs of representing our teams? It was all that kind of stuff. Our program managers were largely on very big, high profile, risky efforts. So we had 200 something teams and there were 6 program managers. So they were not peanut, they were not everywhere, and they were not peanut butter. They were working on things like this because this is a big high profile thing. The vast majority of our teams were individual Scrum teams who were grouped into areas of either like technology or like outcomes. So we had a group that was our AI group that was looking at artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so they were solving all kinds of different problems using the same technology. We had our platform group, different kinds of technologies solving a similar problem. They were largely speaking individual Scrum teams, sometimes working in small groups of 2 or 3, but largely speaking, there was no scaling above that level. My boss was very much against the idea of scaling. In fact, she told me, if I had read your resume, which has SAFe on it, before I hired you, I would never have even interviewed you. She was super duper against scaling. I'm like, well, I'm glad you are lazy and did not read my resume before you interviewed me. That's great. So that is it. You have reached the end of the internet.
Yeah, that I agree with Audrey. Very, very interesting and intriguing and thought-provoking for me, certainly. Gopal, do you want to say something about, so we're moving Enterprise Agile Global Community to quarterly now that our founder has abandoned us. And so our next meeting is going to be in August. Gopal, do you want to talk a little bit about what that's going to be?
Definitely. So thank you, John. As Ron said, very interesting, very thought-provoking. And obviously, you're talking about something that has worked in a large enterprise. So definitely, this is not theoretical. We really appreciate your time and sharing your experience here.
Happy to share.
As Ron said, our next meeting is in Q3. Q2 or Q3? Q3. This is Q2 in Q3. And we are going to have it in mid-August. You'll see that posted in the website, in the meetup site. It's about DevSecOps, talking about, how can DevSecOps be implemented in a major enterprise. So somebody who has been a coach and a trainer of DevSecOps is going to come in. She's going to share with us, her experience with DevSecOps, working with enterprises. So that's what's coming next for us.
It's even hard to say, let alone do.
Exactly.
A round of applause for John. Thank you.
Thank you. This was fun.
That was truly awesome.
Thank you, John.
All
Please
right.
send us the deck, and you referenced a couple of books as well. If you can add that as references, that would be useful for the team.
Sure, I can absolutely do that.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks so
All
much.
right. Have a good evening, folks.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.